It's been 1 week now since Canadians voted in the federal election. Of course, Justin Trudeau back in power, minority government, though. Not an ideal outcome, of course, for him, who 4 years ago sailed to a majority government with his sunny ways. Nevertheless, yes, it is a second term. How long that term lasts, of course, is an open question. A lot of things to cover, from the economy, climate change, and growing regional challenges, particularly, of course, in Western Canada. And how exactly does he get things done in a minority government situation? Well, history says, of course, it can be done. And look no further than the Prime Minister's own father back in 1972. That also was a minority. Now, take a look at the results here. The majority at that point, because the House of Commons was smaller, you needed 133. The Liberals got 109, the PCs got 107, and the New Democrats won 22. And so it led to an interesting scenario in which Pierre-Elliott Trudeau worked with the NDP leader at the time for a period of 2 years. Let's bring in our commentators from the left, the center, and the right to give us their take on how this could all potentially play out. And I'm going to start with Robin Sears in Ottawa for the NDP. Robin, let me start with you, because this was a very interesting scenario in 72. What can Justin Trudeau look for in that parliament to sort of get some advice, perhaps, or a path forward?
You know, I think the most important thing, Todd, is the people that he replaced around him. Like his son, he had a very arrogant PMO around him in his first term that got him into lots of trouble politically, even though they're very smart policy guys. He brought in Jim Coutts and Keith Davey, who were arguably the political operatives of their generation in any political party, and I say that as a New Democrat who was here during that minority government. They were tough, they were flexible, they made a much more political Prime Minister's office out of what they had inherited, and that made a huge difference within the party, first of all, within the caucus, and then in the country. Justin has exactly the same problems. He has an unhappy caucus because they didn't get very well treated in the first term. He has a mixed reading in the party, given how the campaign turned out. And as everybody knows, he's got deep antipathy across the country. So I'd start there.
Liberal strategist Shane Mackenzie, also in the capital. Shane, what's your read on governing like it's 1972?
Well, I think 1972 could be a bit of an instructive example, but we're in a bit of a different circumstance now. We have a couple of different parties we can work with, including the Bloc Québécois, and also, on certain issues, there may be opportunities with the Conservatives. So I think that in 1972, it was very clear the partnership was the NDP Liberals, and I think in this same case, there's a lot of areas for cooperation there: affordable housing, climate action, and universal pharmacare. There's lots of different areas they can work together on, and so hopefully that will be able to continue a more stable relationship. And if the NDP decided to go a different way, the Liberals here have options in order to deliver for Canadians.
Let's just show the 1972 election board one more time here as we bring in Jamie Ellerton for the Conservatives into the conversation as well. And the interesting thing, Jamie, is that it was so close in 72. I mean, really only 2 seats separating the Liberals and the PCs. And even though the NDP, if I'm not mistaken, won the same number of seats in 1968 as they did in 72, of course, they were in a very different place because they helped to prop up Pierre-Elliott Trudeau. And so here we are again. And although the seat count, the spread anyway, is much bigger this time between the Liberals and the Conservatives, it is nevertheless instructive. Your read on this, the whole notion of what Trudeau might be able to look from his father's record for?
Yeah, I think Robin kind of picked up on one of the things that really stands out if we're talking about where Prime Minister Trudeau stands today. And that is, this is a Prime Minister who's had his wings clipped. Justin Trudeau came to power 4 years ago, captained Canada, massive majority, and was supposed to be the beginning of a new political dynasty. And here we are, a short 4 years later, he's been reduced to minority status and lost the popular vote. We see massive regional divisions in this country. The rise of the Bloc Québécois should be a concern to all Canadians, and completely being shut out of the prairie provinces in Alberta and Saskatchewan for the governing caucus is also going to be a grave concern. And so I think if you look at where Justin Trudeau has to build this going forward, I think having some humility first and foremost, and perhaps a little bit more listening, a little less lecturing will help him as he navigates the early days of this minority parliament.
Yeah, it is going to be interesting to see. And we know, of course, the cabinet being put together as we speak. It'll be announced later on in November. Okay, so what about what's going on in the West? And Shane, I want to start with you on this one here. The sort of Western problem problem that the Liberals now face with no MPs in Alberta, no MPs in Saskatchewan, and this sort of blue wall, as you know, that stretches from Manitoba right through deep into the interior of British Columbia. There's talk about, coming up with certain advisors, for example. Alison Redford and a couple of others have been mentioned, Naheed Nenshi as well, maybe Don Iveson, the mayor of Edmonton. This came up over the weekend, and there was automatic pushback by some who said, Alison Redford was not a popular premier of Alberta at all, so be very careful. And Naheed Nenshi is, because of his own politics, perhaps out of touch with what a lot of Albertans want as well. So just be careful with who you're picking if you're looking for Alberta advisors. Your read.
Well, I think that you make a good point that there is need for more consultation, and that's why the first thing the Prime Minister did is he gave a call not only to those, I would say, more centrist voices out of Alberta, like Naheed Nenshi and Alison Redford, but also called up Premiers Moe and Kenney and said, I hear you. I hear that there are things we have to work together on. I don't think that gives either of them a veto on important national policies, but I think that there is still a conversation to be had with those who are sort of channeling the frustration and those who can sort of act as an interlocutor there. So I think that Alison Redford, nice to see her step up. Obviously, she did deal with some more right-wing elements that pushed her out of her own party. So there are challenges there, but I think that the Prime Minister has to reach out to senators, Canadians, and do a lot of work to sort of answer that emotional fear that people have about the security of their jobs in the future. I think there's good news, like more clean jobs in Alberta than there is oil sands jobs. So I think there's opportunities to move forward in an economically viable way.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And the need is really there, to sort of reach out, as you rightly point out, to different people and different voices. Let's bring in Robin Sears. In terms of this need, Robin, what do you think? What's your read?
I think the first person I would look to, and I mentioned this in my Star column yesterday, is Mr. Goodale. He is the father of the Liberal Party in Western Canada. He got defeated, but he has indicated he'd be willing to play a role too. They'd be very crazy not to look to Ralph for some intelligence. But I think, again, going back to 72, there's some parallels there as well. They set up something called the Federal Provincial Relations Office in that period, which was a group of bureaucrats who were trained to deal with their provincial peers on a small number of files to ensure that they got successfully achieved. They can do that again. We have a very weak federal provincial relations structure in Ottawa now because it died over the years, basically. That has to be ramped up, given a senior political leader to run it. And then let's just identify 3 or 4 confidence-building issues that would make Alberta and Saskatchewan feel more part of the family again and push that through. And, mayors and former premiers, forget about it. That's not a realistic solution because, A, it would be offensive to the existing premiers of those provinces who expect they will be the ones who negotiate on their province's behalf.
Yeah, no, that is actually a great point. You sort of wonder what the backlash might be, from Scott Moe and from Jason Kenney to see this, whether, there's this idea they're doing the end run around those two. Let's bring in Jamie Ellerton to the conversation as well as we show the map, Jamie, of how the ridings all went. And you're familiar with it. We're all familiar with it. That blue wall separating the, the Pacific coastline there in the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island from, Manitoba at least, if not almost to Ontario. How much of a problem is this for the Liberals?
I think it is a huge problem because it speaks to national unity in a very real sense. I think, picking up on what Robin just said, the idea that a team of bureaucrats who are going to work better on provincial issues are somehow going to inspire Albertans and people from Saskatchewan to have faith in this government is laughable. Just the same way of having former premier who essentially resigned in disgrace be the face of the Trudeau government in Alberta, where he's relatively despised, is also going to have some traction, is, I think, setting himself up for failure. I think if you actually look at this from a genuine national unity lens, the whole piece of what Western Canada is saying on this is they do not feel part of the Confederation. They feel like the deck is stacked against them, and they don't feel like their concerns are being heard in Ottawa. When you look at what some of those things are, some of that is equalization, some of that is the perceived preference for Quebec on all things national affairs, and the other is the inability to get new pipelines to Tidewater built after Justin Trudeau vetoed Northern Gateway, which was already approved, essentially mothballed Energy East, and then essentially as a result of his own policies put so many roadblocks ahead of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline expansion that they had to nationalize it. So if you're looking at those 3 areas, I think that is where if Justin Trudeau is having a real honest look at himself, what is in the best interest of national unity, and how can he, as leader of Canada, sell these pro-Western Canada policies into Ontario and Quebec to help unite the country. That is, I think, the traction of where he can find some success, not appointing former failed politicians or bureaucrats to oversee it for him.
Yeah, no, valid points. And we're just going to show the seat count for Alberta and also for Saskatchewan and Manitoba as well. And Shane, you got to admit, I mean, it's bleak. There are no Liberals in either of those two provinces. There are some in Manitoba, of course, but not in Saskatchewan, not in Alberta. And the question becomes, you know, how do you reach out, especially if you are a prime minister who already is not very popular in those two provinces?
Well, I would note that, you know, while the results ended up with a complete blue wall of seats, it's not historically different than any result in the last 20 to 30 years to have 70% of Albertans vote Conservative and about 30% vote for progressive parties. So this just ended up in the math the way it did with our first past the post system. They ended up ahead. So he did have 4 seats last time, 2 in downtown Edmonton, 2 in downtown Calgary. There is a path back to those areas. And I think to address pipelines, Justin Trudeau looked at the Harper model that kept getting caught up in court and said, we need to better address Indigenous concerns, environmental concerns, and make sure these projects don't get caught up in court. That was what Harper's projects got stalled for. That's what he's been working to do. And he needs to better communicate that he's actually supporting the efforts that they are making while also in across the country moving forward on a climate plan.
All right, let's go from the Liberals over to the Conservatives and Andrew Scheer, who, like many in the party, trying to figure out what exactly went wrong in the campaign. He says he's spoken to a lot of different Conservatives about what he calls, quote, incredibly disappointing results. We do know he is up for a leadership review in April of next year, and there are rumblings from some that it's time for him to go and that someone new needs to take over in order to try and defeat Justin Trudeau in sort of a rematch, possibly in the next 2 years, 3 years. We'll see, of course, how long this minority government lasts. But nevertheless, is it time for a leadership change should Andrew Scheer go? Robin Sears, you start this one off.
It's a really tough one, Todd. I mean, I've lived through leadership struggles in the NDP over the years, and they're always divisive. And this really, to go back to our historical frame again, would take the Tories back to the days when the Tory syndrome, as it was called then, reemerges. That is to say, endless backbiting and undermining of the leader almost as soon as they were elected. Mulroney put an end to that in the Conservative Party, and then the party split, and it's been banged back together by Mr. Harper. But a leadership contest is always divisive. I think that Mr. Scheer has to do 2 or 3 things to show, A, he takes responsibility for what happened, which he hasn't really done so far, and B, signals he's prepared to make some significant changes to appeal to urban Canadians, and then says, here I stand, I'm not going away. I feel the ground beginning to slip away from him already, though, I have to admit.
Shane, Mackenzie, your read.
Well, I mean, we hear from a number of Conservatives, particularly those in Ontario and Quebec, that they're very frustrated that Andrew Scheer doesn't seem to have learned anything from this campaign. The first thing he was asked was, did you hear from people in Ontario and Quebec that they didn't like your stand on abortion or on same-sex marriage or not marching in pride parades? And he just said, no, I'm not going to change. That's the way I am, and I believe I did nothing wrong. And that's just a message that's not going to jive, and he's going to have his convention in April in Toronto, and I think there's going to be a lot of people looking for a new voice to come forward. While I think it's instructive that Mulcair and other Liberal leaders in past have been turfed prematurely, and it might be better to stick with the incumbent, it seems like Tories are a little bit frustrated, and it might be too late for him.
And last word goes to you, Jamie Ellerton. I mean, you were on the campaign. You worked closely with Andrew Scheer over the course of 6 weeks, and no doubt before that, as this campaign finally came into being and then was executed over the course of those 40-plus days. Your read on what needs to happen. Is it time for Andrew Scheer to go?
So I think it's way too premature to say it's time for Andrew Scheer to go. And I think parties that look to kind of enter leadership races quickly do so to their own detriment. But I think if you look at the broader dynamic shaping up in the Conservative Party, I think Andrew Scheer needs to do a full post-mortem. It's been 1 week since Election Day, and I think what Andrew does over the course of now through to Christmas will really shape what he's learned from this campaign and how he's going to go about solving that, and then as well as in the delegate selection meeting process, because the Leadership Review Convention is not a one membership, one vote like it is for party members. It is strictly of those who are elected delegates at the party convention, and so there's a lot of time there. There's obviously a lot of people who are disappointed with the result, but we also won the popular vote nationally. So let's not throw everything out as a result of overreacting to where this is going to be. So there's lots of time for Andrew Scheer to get this right. And I think showing some of the homework in terms of not just, yes, obviously we lost in Ontario and Quebec, and that's where the Conservative Party needs to improve, but speaking more to how he's going to do that and what changes he's going to make and maybe what new people he's going to be put in place will help inspire the confidence of party membership.
Jamie, great to have you with us, along with Shane and Robin. Thanks for coming on the program today. We'll be talking again, no doubt, in the weeks to come.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Todd.